Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us with our webinar today. Hopefully you've all managed to access okay, and we're expecting a large number of people to join. We've almost 400 people signed up and already 200 on the call. If you're having any problems with the audio or visual, pop a question in the box and my colleague Amy will come back to you directly with some guidance to try and help. Your microphones are already on mute and webcams will be off throughout the webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the question box rather than the raised hand function. All the questions are being monitored and collated by my colleagues on the call. If we don't manage to ask or answer your questions, we'll come back to you with a written response as soon as we can in the coming days. And a copy of the webinar plus the Q&A will be posted on VisitScotland.org and you'll receive an email as a follow-up from my colleague Rachel. So why this webinar? And it's on behalf of the Scottish Tourism Emergency Response Group, which I chair, a group that's made up of the main public agencies, COSLA, representing local authorities, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Skills Development Scotland, the Scottish Government, Scottish Enterprise, South of Scotland Enterprise, and the Scottish Tourism Alliance. And we've been working since last March to try and make sure that we're gathering all the information in relation to the virus and its impact on tourism, and also trying to develop appropriate plans to help us get out of this dreadful situation we're in. One of the key aspects of the work of STERG has been to ensure that we have proper and adequate research and data. This is in fact the third survey we've carried out since March last year. And this is one of the biggest responses we've ever had to monitor the impact of the virus on Scottish tourism. So we commissioned this survey through Progressive Partnership to determine and track the ongoing impact of the pandemic and provide useful insight about our current and future support needs. The survey was carried out anonymously during November and December. And this webinar now invites you to hear the results of the research. I'm going to hand over now to Diane McGregor and Leah Ringland of Progressive Partnership, who will take you through a slide presentation. We'll then come back to the table and answer Q&A from the various input that you've got during the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Riddle. Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen now so that you can all see. So here we are. So thank you so much for the introduction, Riddle. So we're here today to present the results of the survey. Now, just in the word of warning, we've got a lot of data to go through today, and I'm not going to go over every single figure in the charts that you'll see, but as Riddle mentioned, they're going to be available on the Visit Scotland website in the next few days, so you can pore over the detail of it then. But the main objective for today is really to give you an overview of how the whole industry has been impacted by the pandemic, and also looking at some data by sectors and by different regions as well. Of research have been conducted in-house by Visit Scotland, and this is the results of the third wave of research conducted by Progressive Partnership. So today we're here to feed back the results of this third wave. So many of you will have completed the survey and will be familiar with the questions that were asked in it, and thank you so much for those that did respond. We had a fantastic response to it. But for everyone else, this is an overview of how we're going to structure the results today around the questions that were in the questionnaire. So first of all, we're going to look at the impact of the pandemic, specifically on turnover and staff numbers, and also looking at the number of businesses that have ceased trading either on a temporary basis or permanently. We also have looked at what actions businesses have taken to survive the crisis and mitigate the impact of the pandemic, and what further measures are likely to be needed in the coming months. We've also got a number of questions around awareness and usage of advice and support. So we looked at things like awareness and usage of various sources of financial and non-financial support that's available. What sort of challenges have businesses faced in accessing government support? awareness and usage of information and advice from government, sectoral and regional organisations, and ratings. How do you feel about the benefit of various types of support that's been available? And then finally, we'll look at what the outlook is for 2021 in terms of the shorter and longer term for trading and staff retention, and also the types of financial and non-financial support that might be of value for businesses in 2021. So the data was gathered using an online survey. It was sent out to tourism and hospitality businesses across Scotland. The survey link was distributed by the STERG organisations and other industry partners, either directly to the database members or indirectly via their websites. Links were put on websites and also on social media channels as well. And the fieldwork ran from the 19th of November and to the 7th of December in 2020. So the final sample that we got was almost 3,000, which is fantastic. It's a good, robust sample for analysis at the top line level, but we can also dig deep into data when we've got that many responses, and look at lots of subsample analysis as well, which is really, really useful. And the margin of error in that is very small, at between plus or minus 0.3 and plus or minus 1.7%. The other thing really to say in terms of the data analysis, although we do have a big, robust overall sample, within some of the subsamples, the base sizes do get down quite small. So where that's the case, you'll see a little yellow triangle, and that's just to tell you that the base size there is less than 50, and just to be a bit cautious about the results that are reported there. And the other thing to note is, because it is a self-selecting survey, so people volunteer to take part in the research, we can't be absolutely 100% certain that it's representative of the whole industry, the tourism industry in Scotland, our sample. But as you'll see in a minute when I go through the profile of the sample, we've got a really good spread of industry sectors and across Scotland as well. And we're confident, given how widely distributed the survey link was, that we do have a good, robust and representative sample of businesses within this sector. So these are the subsamples that we'll look at as we go through the findings. In terms of industry sector, we've combined them so that we've got good sample bases into non-serviced accommodation, hotels, bed and breakfasts and guest houses, activities, attractions and tours, food, drink and retail, travel and transport and events and festivals. Travel and transport and events and festivals subsamples are quite small, but there's probably fewer businesses in those sectors anyway, so it's not a huge problem. In terms of local authority, we haven't covered every single one because, as I say, the base sizes get very small, but these are the ones that we'll include within this presentation. And some of these we've brought together to give broader classifications of area types, and we've done that by rural local authorities, ones in cities and ones that cover the islands. So before we just get into the survey results, I just wanted to take you back to when the survey was actually happening, which was between the 19th of November and 7th of December last year. It was a different place to where we are now, and I think we have to bear that in mind when we're looking at the research results. So what we've got here is a bit of a timeline in terms of the number of COVID daily positive cases in Scotland and sort of key events that were happening along that timeline in the run-up to the fieldwork and as the fieldwork happened. So at that point, the number of daily cases was very high, but it was fairly stable as well. It wasn't in the upward curve that we've seen more recently. The vaccine was approved during fieldwork, so there was hope and optimism around that as well. And the loosening of restrictions for Christmas was also announced round about the middle of the fieldwork period. So at that point, we felt confident enough to allow people to mix in family groups and so on for 5 days over Christmas. However, there were, just before fieldwork started, 11 local authorities went from level 3 to level 4 just before the fieldwork started. So there was cause for concern at that point as well. And the first vaccine was given the day after fieldwork finished. So it was a worrying time, but it wasn't as worrying as it is now. And obviously, things are very different now to they were back then. So we'll just bear that in mind as we are going through these results. Okay, sample profile. So who responded to the survey? Who did we speak to as part of this research? So this gives us a breakdown in terms of sector, and you'll see that the sample includes a majority of accommodation providers. 2/3 overall of the people that responded to the survey were representing accommodation providers. And we had 1/3 from self-catering, 16% were bed and breakfasts or guest house, and 10% were hotels. And we also have things like camping and caravan and hostels and things like that within that. So that's something to bear in mind when we're looking at the results as well. But what you can see here is we've got a good spread and a representation from all different aspects of the tourism industry in Scotland. And we also found that this profile, comparing it to previous waves of research, is actually very similar to what we had then. We grouped some of those sectors together to just give us more robust subsamples. So as you can see, this is how the sectors are grouped. So overall, we had 39% in non-serviced accommodation, such as self-catering, hostels, and so on. 26% were hotels, B&Bs, and guest houses, and 20% were activities, attractions, and tours. And we had just 7% in retail. So again, that just shows a broad representation of the whole industry. Smaller proportions in events and festivals and travel and tourism. So as I mentioned before, we just have to be a wee bit cautious when the base sizes get small for those ones. And this is how the sample spreads out across Scotland. So the highest response we got was from businesses in the Highlands, 23%, followed by Argyll and the Isles at 10%. But you can see we got the responses to the survey from right across Scotland, from almost every part, and good robust sample sizes in a lot of the areas as well. And again, this was very similar to what we saw in previous waves of research. This chart here, I know it's a lot of numbers and it's probably quite sore in your eyes to look at, but it's just to give you a feel for it's an interesting split in terms of the different profile of businesses that you have in different areas of the country and different cities versus rural and so on. So for example, we found that non-serviced accommodation was particularly dominant in places like Dumfries and Galloway and the Outer Hebrides, Western Isles, Perthshire and so on. But when you get somewhere like Glasgow only had 7% non-serviced accommodation, it was much more dominated by hotels and B&Bs and so on. So there's differences across the profile of businesses in different areas. For example, another one we noticed was that Shetland and Orkney had particularly high proportions of businesses in activities, attractions and tours responding, and Glasgow had a higher than average proportion in the food, drink and retail sector. This is the size of the businesses. So perhaps as we might expect, we've got a high proportion of small businesses in our sample. And these are the turnover figures, the number of staff figures before the COVID pandemic struck. So the number of full-time equivalent staff in 2019-20. So half of the sample at that time were just sole traders, owner proprietor run, and a further 33% had less than 10 employees. So 83% overall were smaller, very small businesses with 10 or less employees in them. We also asked what their number of staff they're currently, and this was obviously at November, December last year, employing, but including those that are on furlough. And we see an increase there in the number of people who say they don't have any staff, that they just run the business on their own. And this is reflected also in turnover. So this is a turnover pre-COVID, and we had 62% with a turnover of 100,000 or less. So most of the businesses are fairly small scale, but we do have 1 in 10 with a turnover of more than $1 million. So there are some big ones in there as well. So that is our sample. So let's get into the actual findings of the survey and find out what they told us about their experiences. So first of all, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on the business. So we asked them how did the reopening of tourism affect their business in the summer when they were able to open again in the summer and the early autumn months. Did that turn out to be better, worse or pretty much as expected, their turnover. As we might expect, the largest proportion, over a third, said that they did worse than expected. However, 1/4 said that they did better, and about a fifth said turnover was pretty much as they had expected. But we did have 1 in 5 here, 19%, that said they didn't reopen at that time. And this is those figures across the different sectors. So the travel and transport sector was the most likely to have done worse than expected when they opened. It was 58% saying that. And the food, drink and retail was the most likely to say that they did better than expected. So 39% felt that when they reopened, it was actually not as bad as they feared. In terms of not opening at that time in the summer and autumn, the highest proportions were found in the activities, attractions and tourism, events and festival sectors. And this is these same figures again across the different regions and local authorities. So the cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow tended to be particularly badly hit, with about half saying that the impact was worse than expected. So we've got 48% there for Edinburgh and 47% for Glasgow. But the Orkney and Shetland had the highest proportion saying that the business did not reopen, so at 36% and 38% there. We also asked them, regardless of whether they did better or worse than they expected, was their turnover actually higher or lower than it had been in 2019 when they reopened? And not surprisingly, the majority, 78%, said that their turnover was lower than normal levels seen in 2019, with 13% saying it was above normal levels. And that's how that splits out across the different sectors there. So almost all in travel and transport and events and festivals said that the turnover was down compared to 2019. But we did see 1 in 5 in non-serviced accommodation and food and drink saying that they actually did a little bit better. But for the majority, even in those sectors, they did do worse. And looking across locations, it was almost all of the businesses based in cities and on the islands reported that the turnover was down compared to 2019. So you can see that in Edinburgh it was 98%, Orkney it was 96%, Glasgow 98% and Shetland 92%. Businesses in Perthshire and Dumfries and Galloway were the least likely to report reduced turnover in 2020, although again almost 2/3 in these areas did report a reduction, so theirs was slightly better but still not good. So we asked them also, as well as asking whether their turnover was up or down, we asked them the percentage it was either up or down. So first of all, looking at those that has said their turnover had gone up, it was only 13% overall, but the average increase was about 23%, and that's how that splits out across different bands of percentages. Far more, of course, 78% said that their turnover was down compared to 2019, and the average decrease was 60%, so it's a significant decrease in turnover there. And we can see this, so this is across the different sectors. So 78% overall, that's the figures we've just seen, just said it was down, and the percentage decrease was on average was 60%. Across the sectors, most of them said that their turnover was down, and for most of them, the turnover was at least 50% reduced on average for businesses in each of those sectors. But events and festivals seems to have been particularly badly hit, with 95% saying that the turnover was lower than normal, and the average decrease was 81%. And then this is the breakdown in terms of areas and regions. So almost all of the businesses located in Edinburgh, Glasgow and the Northern Ireland, so Shetland and Orkney, reported that turnover was down. So we had 98% Edinburgh, 96% Orkney, 98% Glasgow and 92% Shetland, saying that turnover was down. And the highest average percentage decrease was found in Edinburgh. So Edinburgh was particularly badly hit there as well. So looking now at occupancy levels, this is obviously just amongst accommodation providers and just those that opened during the summer and autumn months. The average occupancy, these figures are the average occupancy across accommodation providers, so it includes those that said 0%. So the highest occupancy level was found in August, and on average it was 64%. July was 51%, September 59%, and October 47%. These are obviously much lower than they had been in 2019, because we asked about 2019 average levels as well. So in August in 2019, it was close to 89% on average, in July 85%, and so on. So you can see just how much occupancy levels have dropped since 2019 going into 2020. And this shows the breakdown across cities, rural and islands. So the cities were particularly badly hit in terms of occupancy. They were much lower than rural areas and the islands. And the rural areas tended to do slightly better, although obviously not as good as they would normally do in a normal year. But they tended to do slightly better, which intuitively and anecdotally we know to be true, because people were keen to go to areas where they wouldn't encounter many crowded places. So the rural destinations tended to benefit from that. We also asked them about how much of their revenue had been lost so far this year. So between March 2020 and when they did the survey in November, December. So almost all businesses reported losses due to the pandemic. And it tended to be in this region of 10 to 50,000 overall for 37%. But we had also, if you add up those ones, that comes to 39% said that their losses were over £50,000. And we had some right at the top, about 1 in 10 said that losses were more than £500,000 for them. This figure here is a calculation of the total lost revenue by businesses that responded to the survey. So if we took everybody's lost revenue and added it all up, basically the figure comes to over £1 billion. And that's just people who've responded to this survey. That's not the whole industry. So it just gives us a feel of the scale of the revenue lost across all of these businesses. And this is a breakdown in revenue lost across different sectors. So the value of the revenue loss was highest for the hotels, bed and breakfasts and guest houses. 40% in that sector had lost more than 100,000, which is likely to be due. There's quite a lot of bigger businesses within that sector as well, and the total revenue lost there is 470 million. Non-service accommodation losses tended to be slightly lower, but then again, a lot of those businesses are smaller scale businesses, and that's likely to be the reason for that as well. Over a third of food and drink and the retail sector also recorded high levels of losses in excess of 100,000. So what sort of impact did that have on staffing and employment in the industry? And I'm sure you're all aware that a lot of people have had to lose some of their staff. In total, 76% of those that responded to the survey said that they'd had to reduce staff numbers this year. And the reasons for that were either generally putting staff in furlough or not employing staff that they normally would. But worryingly and sadly, we've also got over a third saying that they've actually made staff permanently redundant. So looking at those people who've had made staff redundant, we asked them also about the numbers involved. So how many of their full-time, part-time and seasonal staff have they had to let go since the start of the pandemic? So let me just explain these figures because it's not immediately clear. But 83% reported that they had to let go of at least some of their full-time staff. And on average, the number of full-time staff that they had to make redundant was 8 in total. 6 in 10, so 61% of businesses that have made staff redundant said that it was part-time staff that they've had to make redundant, and on average that was 9 staff. And then 30% overall of those who have made staff redundant, this isn't the whole sample, it's just of those who've made staff redundant, said it was seasonal staff, So much less than the seasonal, but perhaps they just didn't employ them in the first place in most cases. And the average number of seasonal staff that have been made redundant for each is 13. So the overall average number of staff lost by businesses was around about 17 staff. That's the averages there when you add up the part-time, full-time and seasonal staff. That's been pulled up by a few that had quite a lot of staff made redundant, but for most people, for 67%, the number of redundancies was between 1 and 10 in total. So this is a breakdown here in terms of industry sector. So if we take all businesses within the sectors who have employed staff, so not everybody actually employs staff, so they wouldn't make staff redundant, but amongst those who do employ staff, overall 26% said that they made staff redundant, but that is higher when we look at hotels, B&Bs and guest houses, and particularly it's hotels actually. So amongst hotels, it was 51% said that they made staff redundant. For B&Bs and guest houses, it was actually 16%. A lot of them are smaller businesses. And the average number in this sector was 24.3 staff lost to redundancies. So the hotel sector has been particularly badly hit by staff losses. And then obviously all of this has an impact on individuals, on individual people, on their mental health. And this is one question that we wanted to include in the survey as well, was the question was, in terms of your mental health during the pandemic, to what extent would you say you've been negatively impacted? And people were asked to give a score on a scale from 1 to 10. So 1 would mean they did no negative impact on their mental health at all. 10 meant that they had been negatively impacted a great deal. And it's sad to see, but a lot of this chart is coloured red, which means that they gave a score of 6 or more out of 10 in terms of how negatively impacted they were. And for the total sample, we had 56% giving us a score of 6 or more out of 10, and the overall average score was 5.79. And you can see that how that varies across different industry sectors. So people working in the hotels, bed and breakfast and guest house sector, 60% of them gave a score of 6 or more out of 10, and the average was 6.1. And also food, drink and retail was quite high, 62% giving a score of more than 5, and the average score was 6.17. So a personal impact on a great many people working in the industry. Okay, so that's the impact so far. What we went on to ask them about was what measures have been taken to adapt to the situation and to help them survive through until things get better. So what are the mitigations that we have taken to try and get through the crisis? In terms of measures taken to survive, we asked them, they were shown this list and asked which they had taken, they may take, or they weren't planning to take at all. And the main measures taken were various versions of rationalisation, so scaling back operations, reducing workforce, or reducing the range of products and services that they offer. So round about a half had either already taken these measures or they were planning them. A half were also had already taken out and were planning the creation of new revenue streams, so sort of innovating in terms of new ways of generating income for the business. Selling the business or selling key assets were measures that were only being considered really by a minority of businesses. However, a significant minority, about 1 in 4, were considering selling the business, and 1 in 4 were considering selling assets within the business. This shows how those figures break down by the main industry sectors. So non-serviced accommodation providers were less likely than others to have taken measures than other businesses. So the figures there are smaller when it comes to the non-serviced accommodation providers when you compare it to hotels, B&Bs and guest houses, activities, attractions and tourism, food, drink and retail. So the creation of new revenue streams was highest amongst the activities, tours and attractions sector, and also the food, drink and retail sector. So about 70 to 73% in those sectors had created new revenue streams or were planning to do so. In terms of selling the business, that was more prevalent in hotels, B&Bs and guest houses and non-serviced accommodation compared to the other two sectors there. So about a third of hotels, B&Bs and guest houses were had or considering selling the businesses, and about a quarter for non-serviced accommodation. We also asked if they'd made any changes to their business or planning to do anything different post-COVID-19. And so, for example, targeting new markets, using new distribution channels or creating new products or services. So a third said yes, they'd already done that sort of thing, and 17% said they were planning to. So that's overall half of the businesses had made or were planning changes to the businesses as a result of the pandemic. Most commonly, these were looking for new ways to market their products or targeting new markets. So 67% saying looking for ways to market and sell products, and 60% for targeting new markets. Okay, so that's the measures that have been taken and are planning to take. So what was their outlook at that point? Remember, we're talking to people in November and December 2020, but how were they feeling about 2021 at that point? First of all, we asked them their likelihood of reducing staff numbers in the coming months. So we've seen how many have actually already reduced their staff numbers, but did they feel they were going to have to come back even further in the coming months? And for 56% overall, they considered this likely, with 33% saying it was very likely and 23% saying it was likely. And the main reason for that, although we were in the middle of winter, it was not normal seasonal reductions, it was very much because of the pandemic. 77% of those who said that they were likely to reduce their staff numbers further said that it was simply because of the pandemic. And this is how that breaks down in terms of the different sectors. So when it comes to hotels, bed and breakfasts and guest houses, 7 out of 10 said that they expected to have to reduce staff numbers further in the coming months. And again, that figure was actually higher amongst hotels than it was for bed and breakfasts and guest houses. So amongst hotels on their own, 77, more than 3/4 were expecting to have to lose more staff in the coming months. The majority of food, drink and retail also expected to lose more staff, so that was at 60% for food, drink and retail. So for them, there was also expected to be a continuing impact on staff levels. Looking across regions, we found that businesses based in Stirlingshire, Ayrshire and Arran, Edinburgh Borders and Glasgow were the most likely to anticipate further staff reductions in the coming months. And if you look at cities all banded together, 64% of businesses based in cities expected to reduce their staff levels in the coming months at the time of the survey in December. Another question that was asked looking to the future was how long would their cash reserves last? And very worryingly, 21%, so that's 1 in 5 of the businesses that responded to the survey reported that their cash reserves had already run out, and a further 26% said they only had 3 months of reserves left, and 23% said they had about 6 months. So there's a lot of businesses there that are close to the edge in terms of surviving on their cash reserves. Hotels, B&Bs and guest houses were the most likely to report that cash reserves had already run out. So it's 21% on average, but it was 27% in that group. And 31% said they only had enough for the next 3 months. So that sector is perhaps one of the most precarious. In terms of their plans for the next 6 months, we asked them which of these options they were most likely to be doing in the next 6 months. So either increasing their trading, continuing trading as they are, or reducing trading either because of the COVID restrictions or because of normal season restrictions plus COVID, or just reducing their trading as they normally would. or had they decided to close until next spring. Now, bearing in mind the COVID restrictions were much less at that point, so these figures are likely to be higher now. But at that time, 6 in 10 businesses who were trading anticipated reducing trading in the first part of 2021, so 60% overall, and mostly that was going to be due to COVID restrictions, but 17% overall had decided that they were best just to close now until next spring. And across the sectors, those most likely to have decided to close until next spring were the hotels, B&Bs and guest houses and activities, tours and attractions and non-serviced accommodation to a lesser extent were the ones that are most likely to have decided, but across most of them, they were considering going forward on a reduced basis. Businesses based in Argyll and the Isles, Highlands, Ayrshire and Arran were the most likely to say that they would close until spring, and also Shetland and Stirlingshire as well, although the base sizes are a bit smaller there. But those were the areas where we found the highest proportions, higher than average proportions of respondents saying that they felt the best option for them was to close until next spring until things start to improve. And then we asked them also about the sort of outlook for the whole of 2021. How were they feeling looking forward, maybe a bit more in the longer term? And almost 3/4 of businesses did expect to get through the crisis, but most of these, so the 45% here, expected making changes in order to do so. 1 in 10 sadly do not expect to survive the crisis, and 17% were unsure how they were going to get on at that time. So in terms of sectors, the most optimistic sectors, and across all of the sectors, most businesses did expect to have to make changes to survive the crisis. The most optimistic sectors were non-service accommodation and food, drink and retail, but still there's a lot of worry there, uncertainty, and businesses likely to shut, and also those that will have to make changes to survive. But the most uncertainty and concern was strongest amongst our hotels, bed and breakfasts and guest houses. So 18% were unsure and 14% said they didn't feel that they were likely to survive the whole of 2021. And again, this is how this splits out across different areas. So the expectations that businesses will survive the crisis either by continuing as they are or by making changes was prevalent across all of the areas. However, up to 16% did not expect to survive, and particularly Perthshire, Edinburgh and Dundee and Angus were the ones that were slightly higher than the rest in terms of that perception. Okay, so the next section and the final section is about financial and other types of support that have been provided to businesses in the tourism sector in Scotland, in terms of support that they've accessed already and what would be most beneficial to them in the coming months. So this first chart here tells us what financial support different businesses have used. There's a lot of figures on this, so we'll just point to the main ones here. But the majority of businesses, over 8 out of 10 in fact, have accessed some form of financial support during the pandemic. Most commonly that's been the Business Support Grant Fund, so nearly a half of the businesses have accessed that, or the furlough scheme. So either the furlough scheme that ran to the 31st or the one that started in November, but 36% overall have accessed and used furlough. Sector-specific support was a bit lower down, but you expect that because that's targeted at specific sectors. So we can see the percentage in there, for example, of different sectors that accessed it. But so for the Culture Organisations and Venues Recovery Fund, for example, 1/4 of the businesses in events and festivals had accessed that one, so it was fairly well used within that sector, although overall it comes out very low. The sectors most likely to access financial support were the food, drink and retail sector and hotels, bed and breakfasts and guest guest houses, and those least likely to access support were activities, attractions and tours and non-serviced accommodation. So this next chart will tell us a little bit more about the challenges that businesses have faced in getting access to government support. This was an open-ended question, so people were able to write down in their own words exactly what the challenges they faced, and this is just where we've grouped those in order to analyse and give percentages against it. So this is the proportions of people who gave a response to this question. But the biggest challenge to tourism businesses in terms of accessing government support seems to be that being classified as ineligible for any particular support they might go for. So 60% overall mentioned something to do with eligibility, and this is the breakdown of all the different types of issues that they experienced in terms of that. So it was things like where they were located geographically, what tier they were in. Some of them said that they were considered open and uninvected. They were self-employed, caused problems as well. The fact that they paid council tax and not business rates, not trading long enough, and so on and so forth. There was all sorts of reasons that affected their eligibility for government support, and that was a challenge in terms of accessing it. Other things that were mentioned were things like confusing funding options and information, mentioned by 11%, and funds are just simply insufficient and need more money, 10% on the speed of the application process there as well. So we've got all of the comments that were made by the respondents, but this is just a little bit of a flavour. I won't read these all out word for word, but I'll go through some of them. So for example, this self-catering business in the border said, we fall through the cracks of all funds other than rates relief, which did not compensate enough for the loss of income from which we continue to suffer. And an outdoors activities business in Orkney said, very little of the government support available applies to my business or situation. The one-off newly self-employed grant of $2,000 helped in the short term, but the money has run out now and none of the current support packages seem to apply to my business. So that's the eligibility issue as well. This is as a tour guide in Dundee, for example. Much of the support we were not eligible for because we don't have a business property, so we don't pay rates, and because they were restricted to certain industries. There are lots of different funds available from lots of different organisations. It's all very confusing, but what support is available and when, and if you're eligible. So we've got the full list of everything that everybody said, and that is being poured over to see if there's anything more that can be done. Looking now at non-financial support. So this is looking at awareness of the different sources of non-financial support that was available to the industry. And it was generally fairly good. So 9 out of 10 respondents said that they were aware of at least one of these sources. With the most recognised was industry initiatives such as Good to Go, 66%, 2/3 of businesses were aware of that. And similarly, advice and support from public agencies, 65% were aware of that, and lobbying of government by industry bodies was awareness was at 60%. So generally fairly good awareness of the non-financial support that is out there. The food, drink and retail sector, though, tended to have lower awareness than other sectors. It was consistently lower across all of those compared to other sectors. This chart tells us how useful these different types of support, of non-financial support, are to businesses. So if they were aware of it, they were asked to give a score between 1 and 5 in terms of how useful that support is. And on the whole, most of the support was useful. You can see most of respondents gave marks of either 4 or 5 out of 5 in terms of the usefulness of it. But the most useful was a practical guidance that was given, so sector-specific guidelines for reopening and operating COVID safe. 70% described that as useful. Lobbying of government by industry bodies was also something that was felt to be worthwhile and useful by 66%. And sharing the results of industry and research surveys, the fact that the industry is listening to businesses, also 66% said that was something that they find useful. But I mean, even down at the bottom end here, more people said, for example, advice and support from other agencies such as the FSB. More people thought that was useful than not useful, but just not as useful as some of the ones at the top end of the chart there. So sector-specific guidelines was the most useful type of support. We also asked them about their awareness and usage of sources of information and advice as well. So which of these that were on the list here, which of those were they aware of and which of those had they actually used? So Visit Scotland was the most recognised and the most used. 85% of the businesses that responded said that they were aware of VisitScotland.org and 59% had actually used it. The Scottish Government Business Support website was also widely known. 60% knew it and it was used by 50%. Business Gateway, about half knew of that, but it was only used by a quarter. And then communications from your sector destination organisation, just less than half were aware of that, and 40% had used it. So that was fairly well used as well. We found that usage of the Visit Scotland website, the STA, and comes from sector and destination organisations tended to be lower for food, drink and retail organisations rather than from other sectors. And then communications from sector and destination organisers are particularly likely to be used by non-serviced accommodation providers, so things like self-caterers. It was 60% had used communications from sector and destination organisations, so that was particularly popular in that sector. Awareness and usage of local destination organisations were highest for Moray, Speyside and for Orkney. So of those that they had used, they were asked to say which one that they'd find most useful. So they were only allowed to pick one response for this question, the one that they thought that stood out as being the most useful to them. And the communications from the sector or destination organisation was the top answer here, 25%. 1 in 4 picked that as the most useful source of information and advice, followed by the Scottish Government website, and in third place there, the VisitScotland.org has been the most useful to them. And communications, again, from sector and destination organisations were particularly likely to be described as useful by the non-serviced accommodation sector. So for amongst those, it was 47% selected communications from the sector and destination organisation as being the most useful source of information and advice. Okay. So this next question, so they were asked to rate how important different types of longer term financial support might be to them. Looking forward, what sort of types of financial support would be most critical to them to get through the crisis and survive in the future, in the coming months? And they were asked again to give a mark out of 5, where 5 was critical and 1 was not needed at all. And you can see there that clearly the main thing that would be beneficial in terms of longer term financial support is access to funding from local authorities, the Scottish Government and the UK Government. So governmental funding is a thing that most people would like to see provided. We had 69% giving, 50% saying that's critical, and 69% overall saying giving the top 2 scores for that, 4 or 5 out of 5. Access to cash, either via things like bank loans and overdraft facilities, less popular, 31% giving that a top 2 box score. And then investment in your business from private sector is not something really on the whole that people feel is going to help them. They much rather have this funding support from government. And then they were also asked to rate how beneficial non-financial support would be in the longer term as well. So as well as looking at the financial support, how useful would longer term non-financial support be to businesses in the sector? And again, they were asked to give a mark out of 5, where 5 was very beneficial and 1 was not at all beneficial. So in terms of non-financial support, the main ones that the respondents were looking for was continued lobbying of government on behalf of the tourism industry. 68% overall said that would be very beneficial, and also continued advice and support from industry bodies. 60% said that would be very beneficial as well. So they were the top 2 that they felt would be the most beneficial. Support with recovery marketing is also something that would be useful to around about half of respondents. But in terms of developing a clear business plan and help the Brexit transition, less so. So the top two were the ones that they were most interested in. And this was an open-ended question which asked people if there was anything else that public sector or industry bodies could provide in terms of long-term financial support to help their businesses get through the crisis. So not everybody answered this, but this was an opportunity for people to write in what they felt was going to be most useful to them in the longer term in terms of non-financial support. And you can see of those who did leave a response, almost 1/5 mentioned something to do with lobbying, and we split it out in the different types of lobbying that they would look for example, tax and rates, policy changes, things like licensing and short-term lengths and funds, grants and supporting. But if you add them all up together, overall 18% said something to do with lobbying. A number of businesses were also looking for their sector to be better represented, so inclusion of business sectors, and for 15%, and 12% mentioned promoting Scottish tourism more generally to try and encourage tourism in Scotland. Help with advertising and marketing and social media and so on was mentioned by 9%. And these are some of this is an open-ended question, as I said, so these are some of the things that people said in their verbatim responses. So things like the Scottish Government website offering COVID guidance is very difficult to navigate and not user-friendly. Thank goodness for Cairngorm Business Partnership, which was able to distill the salient information. Overall, there are too many organisations vying for position, offering COVID information and flooding the inbox. Prompt action on the hotel support grant application is essential. So that was from a hotel in the Highlands. And from a bar in Stirlingshire, he said, we need to have a long-term plan for getting back to opening. The current guidelines do not allow enough notice to plan for stock or staff. We cannot organise any reopening with a few days' notice. So it needs to be clear and time-effective information for us to get back to opening. And then this one here is a self-catering organisation in a girl in the Isles. Clarity and reopening requirements, liability indemnification, broad marketing support, coherent strategy across all tourism sectors. So, for example, no visitors will want accommodation in Islay if restaurants are all takeaways only and the distilleries are working but not catering to visitors. So it's a kind of coordinated response that they were looking for. So that takes us through all of our findings here, and thank you for sticking with us almost to the end here. There's a lot of figures to absorb there. So what I'm going to do now is just sum up some of the key findings that came out of the survey for you here. So first of all, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on tourism businesses, so despite the fact that the pandemic was less severe at the time of research than it is now, the situation for very many businesses in the sector was critical. For some, the summer and autumn months were better than expected, but for the large majority experienced lower turnover than 2019, and the decrease was significant. 60% on average was a decrease in turnover. The majority of businesses in all sectors reported that turnover was down, but hotels, B&Bs and guest houses, activities and attractions, events and festivals and travel and transport were the most severely affected. And in terms of occupancy levels for accommodation providers, they were also much lower than in 2019, but particularly so in the cities. So as a result, 3/4 of respondents reported that they had reduced their staff numbers, and with 1/3 making staff permanently redundant, and hotels were the most likely to report that they had made staff redundant and also reported the highest average number of redundancies. In terms of the measures that have been taken to adapt and to survive the crisis, scaling back operations, reducing staff and reducing the range of products and services offered were the main actions that have been taken. And half reported that they had made changes that they plan to continue post-COVID, such as looking at different ways to market and sell, targeting new markets and creating new products and services. Looking ahead, the outlook for 2021. So at the time of the survey, most businesses were still anticipating to have to reduce their staff numbers further in the coming months. 1 in 5 had run out of cash reserves, while a further 1/4 only had enough to last 3 months. But nevertheless, the majority did plan to continue trading, but for most on a reduced basis. 3/4 did expect to survive the crisis, albeit with changes to the business, but 1 in 10 expected to close permanently, and hotels, B&B and guest houses were the most likely to be concerned that they might not survive the crisis. When it comes to support for the sector, so most businesses have been able to access some form of financial support, most commonly the Business Support Grant Fund and furlough. And awareness of sources of non-financial support were also good, and it was generally considered valuable, the non-financial support as well as the financial support. Looking forward, businesses will gain most value from access to funding, lobbying of the government, and advice and support from industry bodies. Those are the things that we felt would be the most beneficial going forward. So thank you very much. I hope you find that interesting. I hope there's some, it reflects a lot of what you already know, I'm quite sure, but it gives you a bit of the figures behind it as well, and lots of food for thought as well. We're now going to go to a question and answer session. So I'm going to hand over to Jackie Suter, who's the Senior Insight Manager at Visit Scotland, and she's going to lead us in the question and answer. Let's stop the screen.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Diane, which was, as I'm sure we'll all appreciate, quite a sobering presentation. I don't think we're under any illusions that it would be anything else. We're obviously, we've been having some questions as we've gone through, which we will try and answer now. So I'm just waiting for Riddle to appear on the screen. There he is. We've obviously got a huge amount of data. One thing I want to say straight away is we've got a huge amount of data from this survey, and I know there's been a couple of comments about, you know, the things have changed rapidly already. We tried really hard. We got the top line findings out within a week before Christmas, actually, and it's you may not appreciate, but there's quite a lot of work that goes into this kind of analysis and depth to get the sectoral and regional information together in this way. Something else we've done is produce a dashboard of information, because I know some sectoral organisations, some regional bodies as well, will want to look at results particularly for their area or their sector. So we have also been working on that. First of all, I suppose a question for Riddle. What was the view of STERG of the research overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think these surveys are very, very useful indeed in terms of helping to plan for the future. And the timing as it was in November, December was really important as well, because there was a Tourism Taskforce report going to the Cabinet, and this formed an additional piece of evidence to them to just emphasise the dire straits that the industry were in. So instead of anecdotal, and there's been loads of anecdotal information, we did have real statistics there that helped us present a much stronger case. I suspect, to be honest, given the huge changes that have happened even since November, December, we're now in a very different place. And interestingly, we've got a STERG meeting tomorrow, and we'll be discussing these results in a wee bit more detail. And I think there could well be an ask to do a follow-up fairly quickly, given the continued uncertainty in relation to how long lockdown is going to happen. Because I suspect a number of people way back in November kind of hoped that things would have changed by now, and we'd have had a much clearer picture of the way ahead, and that's not the case. So, Jackie, just be ready to have another severe team to carry out a follow-up survey. Maybe not as detailed as that, but more specific in terms of how those various public sector agencies can support the industry in the way that we've been able to up until now.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I do appreciate how difficult it was for many businesses to complete the survey that we gave them, especially in terms of, you know, what was the proportion of decrease or increase in their turnover and such like. We got a lot of comments about how challenging some of these questions were to answer. So I just wanted to say personally how grateful we are for people persevering with filling these in, and hopefully you can see that the £1 billion figure that we got just from those who responded to the survey of business loss to Scotland gives really strong evidence to give to the Scottish Government. There's a couple of other questions, Riddle, a particular one on the short-term lets legislation, which there is a fear that it will put many businesses out of business going forward. What are STERG going to be doing about that?
Yeah, given the fact that we have a very, very close working relationship with the Association of Self-Caterers, Fiona Campbell, the chief executive there, has kept me in almost daily contact with her concerns. We have, unusually for Visit Scotland as an organisation, put our head above the parapet here and express concern to government that whilst some elements of the scheme may be required, the timing is not right, right in the middle of a pandemic. So we are asking the government to delay the introduction of this and to make it proportionate. So we followed very clearly and closely the lines that ASSC has taken. I think the thing that has shocked quite a few people is the unintended consequence of drawing bed and breakfast into that regime as well. And given the fact that the B&B sector has not got a very strong overall association like Self-Caterers, then we've been trying to help communicate that out to them through the organisation. Funnily enough, yet again, short-term lets is on the agenda for STERG tomorrow. So we'll make sure that it's further identified with our colleagues in Scottish Government Tourism team. But like the industry, we're very concerned about it. We've seen all the results of the surveys they've carried out, and we're absolutely 100% behind the industry in terms of the unnecessary timing of this in relation to the current situation everyone's finding themselves in.
Okay, thank you. That is all the main questions we actually had. I think, Diane, you might have bamboozled everybody with numbers there. There's quite a lot of data on those charts. To do is our comms team will be in touch with everyone on the webinar. The webinar has also been recorded, so you'll be given a link to that. And if there are further questions, or if you are looking for particular data, then please let us know. When you get that email, there'll be contact details on that, and we will do our very best to help you. We can only go down to a certain level of information because the survey was anonymous and we are not able to identify individual businesses, and we take that very, very seriously. So, but we will do what we can to help if you require further information. Have I answered all the questions, everyone else on the call? Leah, is there any other questions I've missed?
I think there's a couple of other questions, but I think they may be for Riddle to answer, so it may be a case of passing them over and following up with a Q&A document afterwards.
Okay, thank you. That's great.
Jackie, just to say, yeah, no, I suppose just to say, yeah, my thanks as well to individuals who completed the survey and to Progressive for the huge amount of work that was done to create the summary we've got. Just to reassure those on the call, this information just doesn't stick on a shelf and we don't do anything with it. It was really interesting hearing about the future funding support needed very specifically, and that will absolutely be going to government in terms of the support that's needed. As you're probably aware, there are a huge number of funds being launched at the moment. We're delivering 9 in Visit Scotland, but there's about 20 odd. And that absolutely adds to the confusion, and I sympathise with the person that raised that on the research. But we've been given a very strong indication, subject to the Scottish Government getting more funding, that there could well be top-ups to that as we move further along the lockdown situation and the uncertainty. And the other thing to say is that we've been tasked as STERG to lead a recovery plan for the industry over a 5-year period. So there will be an initial phase which will look at the immediate needs and then the medium term, and then the longer term. And all of that will have to have some kind of funding figures on them. And the base for that will be this research. So that is crucial in terms of advising government. What concerns me slightly is that there is a view among certain parts of government that everything will be fine. Once we open up, everything will return to normal and the industry will be fine. And it's very clear from the research here that that is not going to be the case. And so I think the more evidence we can get to support a very strong long-term case for the industry is very important. So that's why this research has been absolutely crucial, and why we will almost certainly have to do some kind of follow-up in the months ahead.